Welcome to Bible study. We're winding down Genesis. We got two more. We're doing Joseph's story today. I have to tell you, almost every book of the Bible that we've done, by the end, I fall deeper and deeper in love with it. I am struggling. I'm really struggling. And so I actually have been doing some work this week because I feel like, okay, why are we doing this? Like, I gotta feel like I understand that, right? And one, I think we gotta hold central. These are stories that were fundamental to the earliest Christians, including Jesus, right? The earliest Jews, these were their stories. These were their sacred scriptures. Everything that's going to come out of the New Testament is going to be built upon these foundational stories, right? And at their core, they are stories about being in relationship with God. And sometimes it's ugly, and sometimes it's messy, and sometimes it's beautiful, but it's this enduring story of God's presence, right? So I think it matters to us if we're going to study other books. I think it also really matters because I've been thinking about this from an ecumenical standpoint, right? These are Judea stories. These are Israel stories. These are our Jewish siblings' stories, the most sacred of stories, the core covenantal stories of God's promises. So this is the foundation upon which everything else is going to be built. And these stories of promise are going to sustain a people through centuries of oppression all the way up until the Holocaust, right? These are the stories of God's enduring promise. So as I struggle with these stories and thinking, I just want to be done with Genesis, I am holding on to this other kind of ecumenical understanding. These are the stories that have provided comfort and consolation and witness to God's promises through the worst of time for Israel. These are the ones that held them. Okay, so that's what I want you to hold on to as we okay. Mm-hmm. So if even if you don't like them, hold on to them for the sake of our Jewish siblings. Okay, let's dive into Joseph. And these are really important stories because these are the stories where we're going to move out of the individual patriarchs into Israel's story. Okay, so where we left off, we went through Abraham's, Isaac's stories. We heard about Jacob fleeing, and then Jacob goes off, has this incredibly prosperous life, and he returns to his homeland with all of his kids and all of his wife, makes peace with his brother, and buries his dad. So this tail end of Genesis begins actually with the end of Jacob telling the story of his most favored son. And that's where we're going to spend the next 2 weeks. This is really critical because this is the bridge that is going to take the Israelites out of the promised land and lead them into exile. So this is the foundation upon which Exodus will emerge. So would someone like to read this one?
I will.
Go ahead, Chris.
Okay, just a warning. I'm having terrific hay fever this morning. Okay, Jacob lived in the land where his father had stayed, the land of Canaan. This is the account of Jacob's family line. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the son of Zilpah, his father's wives, and he brought their father a bad report about them. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any other sons, because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made an ornate robe for him. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it."
Okay, our introduction to Joseph, right? Okay, so we're moving the story again from Israel, remember that is Jacob, to Joseph. And that is going to propel us into the next book of the Torah or the Pentateuch, right? But before there can be a Moses that's going to lead the Jews out of Egypt, there has to be a Joseph who is going to lead a small band into Egypt. Okay, so who is Joseph when we first meet him? We find out he's the favorite son of Israel. Joseph's mom is Rachel. Remember, Rachel is the one that Jacob worked for, 14 years to marry. It was his true love. And Rachel took forever to get pregnant. And so this was a baby born late, heavily desired, prayed for, and loved upon birth. So this little baby Joseph is showered with affection by his father. And Joseph is so loved that his dad makes him a special coat. Now special coat is translated as a coat of many colors. This is important because the coat is a long-sleeved coat. You do not wear long sleeve coats if you are doing hard labor, right? So this says something about Joseph and his role in the family. He, one, was the recipient of treasured gifts from his father, and two, didn't do the hard work that is necessary to keep the family going. We know that coat more popularly as it was translated into the musical Joseph in the Amazing Technicolor Dream Coat, Andrew Lloyd Webber's one. Or The Great Love of My Life, Donny Osmond. There's his depiction of the coat. Who did not have a crush on Donny Osmond?
No, I did.
Oh, come on. And look at him in that coat. That was like the dream right there, Donny Osmond.
Too young for me.
Okay, well, there's Donny Osmond in the Technicolor coat. Okay, what else do we know about Joseph? He frequently tattles on his brothers, and his relationship with his brothers has deteriorated. Joseph is a dreamer, and he starts having dreams, and he foolishly shares those dreams with his brothers. And these dreams hint at this future where Joseph's in charge and the brothers are bowing down to him. Remember, he's a 17-year-old boy who stays in the camp, doesn't do the hard labor. His brothers are out tending the fields. They're older by, 5 to 20 years. And here you have this upstart teenager telling him that in his prophecy dreams, they're going to bow down to him, right? So, it's okay that Joseph had the dreams, but then he goes ahead and he shares them. And that's so detritus to the relationship that even his loving father tells him he's got to back off. Okay, so let's talk about what happens to Joseph. Will somebody read this one?
I will.
Go ahead, Diane.
So Joseph went after his brothers and found them near Dothan, but they saw him in the distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. "Here comes that dreamer," they said to each other. "Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams." He recognized it and said, "It is my son's robe. Some ferocious animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces." Then Jacob tore his clothes, put on a sackcloth, and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and daughters came to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. "No," he said, "I will continue to mourn until I join my son in the grave." So his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard.
Sorry, that was a little confusing. I took out a chunk in there. Sorry about that. So basically, here's what happens. The brothers have had enough. My dogs are fighting behind me. I don't know if you, they're like both in the cage. Eric fighting over the seat. So that's the background context here. So Joseph goes to find his brothers, and they're out working in the field. The brothers see him coming, and they plan to kill him. If you kill the dreamer, you kill the dreamers, right? So that ends this problem. So here's the part I cut out though. Reuben, his brother, remember half brother, so that's Leah's son. Reuben's going to try to save him and rescue him. Reuben is the head of the northern tribe of Israel eventually. So he kind of comes off as a potential hero here. The only one that have the brothers that has any redeeming qualities. All the other brothers agree not to kill him, but they're going to sell him as to a slave trader. So they get him catch him in a well, and they sell him to a slave trader. So they get rid of him. Their intention was to kill him. Reuben steps in. Now they come back home and they have to explain where Joseph has gone to the father who loves him so much. And they bring back Joseph's bloody coat. Remember the Technicolor coat that Donny Osmond sported so beautifully. And it's covered in blood and it's ripped up, and Israel concludes that his beloved Joseph was eaten by a wild animal. So remember, Jacob was the deceiver at the beginning of his story, and now again, like he was with his bride choices, he becomes the deceived. His own sons trick him. So, but Israel's so devastated with grief, and this grief is going to linger on and on and on. The chapter is going to end with this family surrounded in gloom, and we find out that Joseph is on his way to Egypt, and he has been sold into Pharaoh's household. Okay, so now we're going to come to a very odd little detour, which is the story of Tamir. So would someone like to read this one? Tony, did you have your hand up?
Yeah.
Go ahead and read this story of Tamir.
About 3 months later, Judah was told, your daughter-in-law Tamir is guilty of prostitution, and as a result, she is now pregnant. Judah said, bring her out and have her burned to death. As she was being brought out, she sent a message to her father-in-law. I am pregnant by the man who owns thee, she said. And she added, see if you recognize those whose seal and cord and staff these are. Judah recognized them and said, she is more righteous than I, since I wouldn't give her to my son Shelah. And he did not sleep with her again. When the time came for her to give birth, there were twin boys in her womb. As she was giving birth, one of them pulled out his hand, so the midwife took a scarlet thread and tied it on his wrist and said, this one came out first. But when he drew back his hand, his brother came out, and she said, so this is how you have broken out. And he was named Perez. And then his brother, who had the scarlet thread on his wrist, came out, and he was called Zerah.
Thanks, Tony. This is like a total non sequitur, right? So we're really in Joseph's story. And then you get this odd chapter on Tamir. So let's figure out what's happening. First of all, I want you to remember what we know about Genesis. It is not one story with one author. It's a collection of stories that have been compressed together, right? So here's what happened in the story. The story of Joseph is going to be interrupted by this story of Tamir and her father-in-law, Judah, who is one of Joseph's brothers, one of Leah's son. He is the fourth son of Leah. Judah goes out and marries a Canaanite woman and has 3 sons. Now we know, if those of you were here last week, that is not done, right? You are not to marry from the Canaanite tribe. That's why Abraham sent Isaac all the way, sent away to get the bride from Rachel from so far away. That's why there's been this this push for Jacob to get brides from his uncle. You do not marry a Canaanite woman. This is the foundational understanding that's going to flow out of here into the rest of the Hebrew scriptures. So Judah chooses a wife for his oldest son named Tamar. Now, in Genesis, we know that a woman's main purpose is to produce the male heirs, to continue the line, and she's no exception, except her husband dies, and she has no children. So she dies a widow with no children. The tradition of the time is that the husband's brother takes her as his wife so that he would have an heir. So the brother does marry her, but does not impregnate her, right? So instead he spills his seeds. This offends God because, they were intended to have the child. So God kills the brother. Okay, this is the text that to this day the Catholic Church uses as the spiritual condemnation for masturbation. This is the text right here from Tamar. For centuries, this is the one that was cited. This is that God punished the second son. So now you can look at it in the larger context of what's going on here, right? Okay, so Tamar has lost 2 husbands and still has no children, but there's one more brother. So she goes to live in the father's household and wait for the 3rd brother to grow up so she can marry him. She has no choices. This is it, right? She can't pack up and leave. She has one choice. She has to marry the surviving son. But Judah, Jacob's son, does not want his last son killed, right? So this is like the widowmaker. He does not want to lose his son by marrying Tamar. So, and Tamar's stuck. She can't marry another man. She can only marry the next brother. So Tamar figures out that Judah, her father-in-law, is not going to honor this tradition. And so she has to force his hand. So she pretends to be a prostitute and she gets Judah to have sex with her and becomes pregnant. So Judah, not knowing it's his child, calls her out and calls for her and the child to be burned. But Tamar shows him proof that the child is his. So Judah's got his back against the wall. He's forced publicly to acknowledge her righteousness. And it ends with her giving birth to twins. She is going to then disappear from all scripture, except for when we come to the Gospel of Matthew, when you're going to see her name in Jesus's genealogy. Very odd. Biblical scholars have fought about it for years, what it means. But her name shows up in Jesus's genealogy. So the purpose of this story is to provide this connection between Judah and the land of southern Canaan. All of these stories, while confusing, and we may be head scratching to say, why is this here? Why are we spending time on it? You have to put it back in the ancient context of these stories provide the link to the tribes that will be in all of the contested lands around Israel. So these are the stories that lead to it, okay? Okay, with that odd little detour, we are back to Joseph's story. Now, Joseph is taken down to Egypt and purchased as a slave in the household of one of Pharaoh's officials. He's the captain of the guard. And the scripture reads that the Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered. He lived in this Egyptian house, and he had all of this success. The Lord was with him, right? So now the next couple chapters are going to map Joseph's rise, his downfall, and his rise again to even greater power. So this captain of the guard, he sees God's blessing on Joseph. He promotes him to run his household. As the person in charge, Joseph is going to be in charge of everything. This is going to be a theme for Joseph throughout this story. God is going to be with him. Now he's going to go through some awful times, but God is going to be with him. Little side note on this one is that Joseph's story is one that is very often lifted up as by prosperity preachers. Which prosperity theology basically says God is with you. So here's the cynic in me. You can play the lotto, you can bet on stocks, you deserve to be wealthy and rich. Prosperity, and I am a big naysayer when it comes to prosperity theology. I don't know how these people end up reading this in the scripture, but one of the stories they frequently turn to is Joseph's story about how God was with him, and in turn, Joseph prospered. Okay, Genesis 39. Let's talk a little bit about some of the bad things that are going to happen to Joseph. Will someone read this one?
I can.
Thanks, Shirley.
Now Joseph was well built and handsome, and after a while his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, "Come to bed with me." But he refused. "With me in charge," he told her, "my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns he has entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" And though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even be with her. These are real soap operas.
They're real soap operas, right? Okay, so the official's wife starts to sexually harass Joseph, and Joseph's going to refuse her. He's being portrayed as a man of integrity. He's not going to betray his employer or his God, but she is going to keep up the pressure. Now, finally, it reaches a point where one day Joseph refuses, and she grabs his coat, and when he runs out, she tells everybody he has attempted to rape her, right? And interestingly enough, this story has questioned who the villain is in this story, back and forth through time. So let's read about how it goes from here. Somebody want to take this one? Why don't you keep going, Shirley?
When his master heard the story, his wife told him, saying, "This is how your slave treated me." He burned with anger. Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. But while Joseph was there in the prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in the prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care, because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did.
Okay, so do you see how there's this unrelenting drumbeat of prosperity? So that's why prosperity proponents and preachers always return to this story. Even though bad things happen to them, they cling to that drumbeat for their prosperity theology. So Joseph's unjustly accused of rape. So his owner believes that he attempted to rape his wife, so he's put in jail. So he's got this, he's thrown in a pit, sold to slavery, comes out, ending up running a household, still a slave, but running a house, then gets sexually assaulted by the woman in power in the household, and charged with rape, thrown back in prison. But even in prison, God's with him, and he prospers. So he doesn't languish in prison. Okay. So then we come into this odd little story of the cupbearer and the baker. This was too big to put in there. So what happens is, while Joseph is in prison, the king's baker and the cupbearer piss off the king. And so the king sends them off to prison. And Joseph, who's there in prison, is told to serve them. So both the cupbearer and the baker have dreams on the same night, and both tell Joseph about those dreams, and Joseph interprets the dream. The cupbearer's dream is he's going to be restored to his position in 3 days. And Joseph asks that when that happens, will you please remember me and help me get released? The baker dreams that he's going to be killed in 3 days by the king. So clearly Joseph doesn't ask for any help from the baker, right? Both dreams turn out as Joseph predicts. So he interprets the dreams, tell them what they mean, and it turns out cupbearer gets out in 3 days. Baker dies. So the cupbearer returns to the king's service and promptly forgets about Joseph. So doesn't quite turn out the way Joseph imagined. So let's talk a little bit about dreams. So dreams in ancient times were believed to be metaphysical messages. So from supernatural entities, and that goes through all ancient cultures. In the Hebrew context, it means from Yahweh. So properly interpreting dreams was highly respected, considered like a scientific endeavor. So what they did was they had giant libraries of dream book compilations to understand the dreams. The individuals who interpreted dreams for royalty were held in very high esteem. Again, this was how ancient cultures understood the gods communicating, was through dreams. So interpreting those dreams was really, really critical. So Joseph believes that anyone God chooses can interpret dreams. It doesn't have to be the official dream interpreter. Do not interpretations belong to God? So God gets to pick the interpreter. And Joseph is one of those people who has been chosen by God to be an interpreter of dreams. So Joseph is simply revealing what God has made known to him. So the interpretation is not Joseph's, the interpretations is God's. So this ability to interpret dreams is further proof that God is still with Joseph, still blessing him. Okay, now we're going to get to the pivotal point in the story where Joseph's going to see his opportunity. Will someone read this one for us? Remember, he's been in prison now 2 years since that cupbearer went away. Go ahead, Chris.
When 2 full years had passed, Pharaoh had a dream. He was standing by the Nile when out in the river there came up 7 cows, sleek and fat, and they grazed among the reeds. After them, 7 other cows, ugly and gaunt, came up out of the Nile and stood beside those on the river bank. And the cows that were ugly and gaunt ate up the 7 sleek, fat cows. Then Pharaoh woke up. That's my husband, sorry. He fell asleep again and had a second dream. 7 heads of grain, healthy and good, were growing on a single stalk. After them, 7 other heads of grain sprouted, thin and scorched by the east wind. The thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 healthy, full heads. Then Pharaoh woke up. It had been a dream. In the morning, his mind was troubled, so he sent for all the magicians and wise men of Egypt. Pharaoh told them of his dreams, but no one could interpret them for him.
Okay, so remember, Pharaoh's royalty, so he has a whole network, right, of people who can interpret his dreams. And he has 2 really disturbing dreams. The first dream is about the Nile, which is the lifeblood of Egypt. It symbolizes fertility, the source of Egyptian power. So any attack on the Nile would be an attack on Pharaoh. The second dream is about plague and drought and destruction of crops, and nobody knows what these are mean. So finally, the cupbearer, after 2 years, remembers back to his time in prison, and he remembers Joseph interpreting his dream and mentions him to Pharaoh. Okay, let's go on with the story. Someone read this one for us. Diane, you want to take this one?
Sure. And now let Pharaoh look for a discerning and wise man and put him in charge of the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh appoint commissioners over the land to take 1/5 of the harvest of Egypt during the 7 years of abundance. They should collect all the food of these good years that are coming and store up the grain under the authority of Pharaoh to be kept in the cities for food. This food should be held in reserve for the country, to be used during the 7 years of famine that will come upon Egypt, so that the country may not be ruined by the famine. The plan seemed good to Pharaoh and to all his officials. So Pharaoh asked them, "Can we find anyone like this man, one in whom is the Spirit of God?" Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you."
So Joseph's brought to Pharaoh, and he interprets Pharaoh's dream to mean that there is a famine coming, and they need to store up food for 7 years to prepare for the famine. So, and Joseph's going to make it very clear that Pharaoh knows it is not Joseph, but God who is source of the dreams and the interpretation. So Joseph comes off as a very righteous man, right? And Pharaoh is so impressed with him, he puts him in charge. So Joseph goes from jail to being in charge of this massive FEMA response to an upcoming plague. And in this move, Joseph becomes second only to Pharaoh. So he is going to take a massive leap in prestige. What's going to happen then is Joseph is going to marry an Egyptian woman that Pharaoh sets him up. And for 7 years, he's going to very, very cautiously and judiciously manage all of the crops. And every year, he's going to put away 1/5 to prepare for the coming drought. When the famine comes, and it will come, when the drought comes, Egypt has all of the stores needed to care for their people and all the people who are going to come there to be fed. Okay, let me just stop there before we go into small groups. And just touch base. This takes us all the way up to the point where Joseph is, oh, hi, Paul. Joseph is restored and he's in power, and bad times are going to hit. The bad times are what are going to send the remaining family members of Joseph into Egypt. This lays the groundwork for the family to come, the final step of Israel going down into Egypt. Questions, comments, reactions, anything? There's some weirdness in this.
Well, the cynic in me says Joseph's a bit of a hustler.
Kind of a survivor, right?
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
Interpreting the dream such that to the Pharaoh puts himself in such a good light. I mean, they're just incredible stories. They really are fascinating. And then some of them are, the thing that always strikes me is how much murdering and killing for there, even ones we didn't read where the one guy got killed, right? The cupbearer lives, but the other guy gets killed. There's so much murder, and then the Lord kills people. Puts them to death. Yeah, it's a violent God that's in these stories.
Oh. And it's a God that doesn't abandon Joseph, right? through all of that awfulness, he isn't left alone. So. Anybody else? Go ahead, Marie.
This is being written later. So afterwards, it's easy to say, okay, this must be what God was doing. And this is why God told them to do this, because see how it turns out. You know, in afterwards how it did turn out. And we're the same now.
Mm. Thank you, Marie. Okay, I'm gonna send you off into your rooms. Here's the question for reflection. Let me do that. Joseph knows attempted murder, enslavement, prison, and sexual harassment in all the chapters we just read. How do you think these affected him? So remember how it starts. He's this very entitled, loved, spoiled young man. He's sold into slavery, and he knows some awful times. How do you think these experiences affected him? That's the question that we're going to deal with in small groups. And I'll send you out for maybe about 7 or 8 minutes, and then I'll bring you back, okay? So how did Joseph change from the beginning of these stories about him to where we're at now? I'll see you in a little bit. Welcome back. So sometimes y'all linger or come back quickly. So it took a while for y'all to get back. What sort of observations did you come up with on Joseph?
That he was an immature young man when this all started. And he ended up being a great manager of people and came up in the world and proved everybody wrong, or his brothers wrong.
We kind of stuck the word manipulator in there instead.
Yeah.
He's got, and that would make sense. He's got a deep history of manipulation there with his ancestors, right?
Yeah. He knew how to work the ropes really well, and probably had to survive those earlier years with the siblings so against him. And he was smart enough to figure out how to do all that.
Mm-hmm.
And he was good looking and well built.
And
too.
well built. And that takes precedence over everything.
Right.
It's very important in these stories.
There you go.
But he didn't take, any of the credit. It was all God was with him, which
Mhm.
also is attractive to people, right? He's
Mhm.
not showing his
Humble by giving off the credit to somebody else.
anybody
Yeah.
else. Interpreting those dreams and it happened. That's how it turned out. Very clever.
But then, he's covering his ass. Because if that doesn't happen, he says, well, God told me.
Yes.
It was God's interpretation.
That's right, not mine.
Yeah.
Can't lose.
But each time he rose up, he was running the prison, then he's running the Egypt practically, right? Second to he ends being second to the Pharaoh. Oh
Yep.
my goodness.
Yeah. Now you all know what happens next, right? So his family is going to starve. They have nowhere to go except to Egypt. So the brother that they lied about, tried to kill, sold into slavery, is the one who is going to hold their fate in his hands. So it's building to this really powerful climax. You've now seen the arc of Joseph's development from this kind of self-centered, manipulative teen. Had some hard life lessons. Now is in a position of power, and he is going to decide his family's fate.
Wow.
So it's going to lead to a really powerful arc. it is where it leads is one of my favorite stories in the Bible. So I think it's a beautiful way to end Genesis. And it really fits well with all the work we've been doing in Sunday worship around being on the way and those big uncomfortable requests that we get from Jesus's teaching. We're going to see it lived out in Joseph's story.
Why is he not a patriarch? Why is Joseph not considered a patriarch?
I don't know. He's not there. He begins Israel's story in Egypt. So the patriarchs are the three that are buried in the patriarch's tomb in Hebron. Joseph is not, as neither is Rebecca.
How many years are the Israelites in Egypt?
Several generations, because they will go there. We're going to see it next week. They're going to go. It's going to end with them prospering. And Exodus is going to begin after many generations, and different pharaohs have come and risen to power, and the Israelites have become enslaved. Yeah. So.
Which is kind of the story of the Jewish history all the way through history.
Yes.
They become powerful and then they become,
Yeah.
then society decides they have to be got rid of or whatever.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to let you go then, but with a plea. Some time at the end of next week, so I'd really love to engage you about some dialogue about what we're going to do next year. So what's on the table is another, I think it might be good to revisit, here's some options. It would be good to revisit a prophet. We haven't done one since Isaiah. I think it would be interested to keep going with the story and work our way into Exodus. There's some powerful stories in Exodus. I think we have not done Matthew's gospel or John's. I think it'd probably be time to take on Matthew next. And Bernie brought up a great suggestion about the stories related to Magdalene, and which I know Reverend Michael has a lot of passion about, and I have some from a scholar standpoint, and she has some from a spiritual standpoint. So I think that would be a really interesting one as well. And I'm curious if there are any kind of historical pieces that you're curious about. We've done early Christianity, we've done Reformation Christianity. If there's a time period that you're curious about, or any type of historical piece that we've got. And we've done the book of Revelations and Paul's letters. There's a bunch of other letters that are in there in the New Testament that we could also look at. So lots of different options to think about. I'd be really curious to hear your input next week about what you think we should focus on next year, and we'll create that plan together. Okay. And then also put in a plug that on April 4th. So we'll finish up with Joseph's story next week. And then the week after, on April 4th for Holy Week, I'm going to teach a special class on the pre and post Easter Jesus. So I preach and teach from an understanding of a pre and post Easter Jesus, and I've never taken the time to explain what that is. So I think it's a really beautiful concept of understanding who was Jesus pre-Easter, who was Jesus post-Easter, and Holy Week's a great time to do that. So that's just going to be a 1-hour class I'm going to teach on Holy Week. Okay.
Is that on a Tuesday?
Yeah, it'll just be on our Tuesday regular time at 1 o'clock.
Okay.
Okay, everyone. Then I'll let
Thank
you
you.
go enjoy your day. Have a good day.
Thank
Thank
you.
Take care, everyone.